So the two hardest things in bass fishing is to find actively feeding fish and also to trigger inactive fish. And there's one way that you can do both of those, and that is with a jerkbait. What I want to break down is the things that you need to know that aren't talked about in the rest of the bass fishing world with a jerkbait, from beginner tips to some of the more advanced things that I notice with a jerkbait. So a jerkbait is a great way to cover water and trigger fish like I just talked about, but one of the biggest things that I want to talk about is some of the colors that I like to throw with it. I'm going to keep it really simple with that, the action that I throw with it, and the rod I use, and just a little bit about the nuances that this bait has that other people don't realize. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the colors that I throw with it. I throw 3 colors. I throw a natural shad, more of a translucent one. I throw like a solid color shad, and then I throw something eye-popping, and that all depends on the water clarity and the water condition. So if I get a little more overcast throughout the day, then I'm going to throw probably more of a natural shad. If it's a little bit calmer and clearer water, I'm going to throw more of that clear shad, that natural translucent. And then if I get a little bit of stained water, or it gets really overcast and really windy, then I'll throw that little bit brighter bait that pops a little bit more and stands out to those fish. But those are the 3 colors that I'm going to throw. The next thing that I want to talk about is the hooks that baits come with, because the hooks that come with baits standard generally suck. 6th Sense has some decent hooks that come with it, but they're not good for every situation. There's 2 types of hooks that I focus on. That is going to be EWG style treble hooks that the 6th Sense baits come with, so they come down and then they point back. And then there's the typical U-bend treble hooks. Now the difference with those 2 hooks is that the EWG style treble hooks work really, really good once you've hooked the fish. But they don't work good if fish are just slapping at the bait. The round bend hooks are really, really good when fish are slapping at the bait, but don't necessarily have the holding power that the EWG style hooks are going to have. So that's something that you have to think about when you're on a jerkbait bite or you're throwing it, is visualize and look at every bite that you get and try to see which hook is going to line up better, because I will change my hooks depending on which way the fish are eating. If they're choking it every time, I'm going to go to those EWG style hooks. But if they're just slapping at the bait, I'm going to go to the round bend style hooks. But that is a huge part of jerkbait fishing, because it gets a bad rap because people are losing fish, and a lot of times it's just because they're throwing the wrong hooks. Another reason they lose a lot of fish is because they're throwing the wrong rod. If there is one rod in my arsenal that I put more money into than any other rod, it is going to be my jerkbait rod, for this sole reason. You have to have the right action to get the most out of that bait, but you also have the right action to not lose fish once you've triggered them to biting. So what you want to have is, you want to have something with a faster tip. You know, the first 8 inches to a foot of it, I like to be a little bit stiffer. But then behind that, I like to have more of a parabolic bend that gives me the opportunity to load up once I've hooked that fish. If you have too soft of a rod, what ends up happening is that rod takes all of the cushion, so when you pull that bait, it doesn't snap it. And it just kind of loads it up like a crankbait rod, and that's not what you want to have with a jerkbait. You want to have a rod that when you snap it, it pulls that bait immediately and gets that bait to dart back and forth and get that side-to-side cutting action. That is absolutely crucial to throwing a jerkbait. So the rod that I like to throw is the Arc Reinforcer Pro. You'll see that, and it is 6 foot 8 inches, and it has that both of those best. So the rod that I like to throw is that Arc Reinforcer Pro, and it has the best of both worlds there. So the rod length you want to pair to your height, because of how you're working a jerkbait down and kind of at a 45-degree angle, or even like an 80-degree angle down. If you have too long of a rod, you're going to overwork it and you're going to wear your shoulder out. So that's why I go with a lighter, shorter rod. And that Arc Reinforcer Pro does an excellent deal with that. You know, being 6 foot 8 inches, and I'm a short guy, it's a light rod, but it also has that little bit stiffer tip, but it also loads up because you can see it's a regular action. So you kind of get the best of both worlds there. There's also some other really great options. St. Croix makes a really good jerkbait rod, and there are a lot of other companies that make a good jerkbait rod, but don't skimp on it. I typically have a rod that I will throw nothing but jerkbaits on, whereas a lot of the other rods in my arsenal I will throw different baits on. So that's very, very important, is the rod. The next is the reel. I like 2 different reels. If I'm fishing in cold water, I might go with a 6:3-to-1 gear ratio reel, because that forces me to slow down and not take up as much line. In the summertime, or once that water starts to warm up, I'm going to go to an 8:2-to-1, because I can fish that bait faster, and what that allows me to do is pick up slack faster and catch up to those fish faster. So when I hit them, I can reel down real quick and get onto those fish, especially smallmouth. Now, that can be kind of give and take because I've gotten used to that and I like that way. But for some people, you might reel down too hard with that 8-2-to-1 and pull that out of that fish's mouth. So for you guys that are just beginning, I would go to a 7-2-to-1 gear ratio reel. That would be a really good starting place because you get then the best of the both worlds there. So real quick, guys, if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button to follow along with the channel. I have regular content coming out every Tuesday, and I'm starting to get back into throwing it out there every Thursday at 7 p.m. as well. Regular content just like this you won't want to miss. Now, when you're throwing a jerkbait, it is one of my absolute favorite baits for the sole reason that most people don't throw it, and specifically most people don't throw it right. That is why I love a jerkbait more than anything else, and I will lock it in my hand all day, is because when I see people fishing it, I know they're not fishing it as well as me, and that's just plain out fact because I've put the time into it. If you watch somebody like Kevin Van Dam throw a jerkbait, what he likes to do is he twitches that, and then he throws the rod tip straight back at the, where you're fishing it. So when you snap it, and you point it back. You snap down, and then you point it back. And what that does is when you pull it, then you're giving it line, so you will get it to jerk, but then when you fade that rod back at it, or you point the rod back, that bait kicks off. And that will allow you to get more cutting action out of your bait as opposed to most people that are getting like this. My bait will be going way out, back, and forth, and that just triggers more fish. Now, another big key to jerkbait fishing that most people don't think about is the line size. I typically will run 10-12 if I'm in deeper clear water settings, if I'm throwing that +1, or if I'm throwing a Megabass Vision 110 +2, getting really deep, and I want to get that bait deep. But a lot of times if I'm throwing a shallower bait, like that 6 cents Provoke, just in the original version, I will be throwing like 15-pound line, because that'll kind of keep that bait up a little bit. But it's all about personal preference and figuring out how deep you need that bait to go. And talking about depth, there's 3 models of jerkbaits that you're going to want to deal with. I've given you 3 color options. Now there's 3 different sizes. 6 Cents has an original Provoke, and they have the Provoke +1, or the Provoke DD is what they call it. That is like a Megabass Vision 110. You get a little bit longer bill. That's 6 to 10 foot diving. And then there's like a Megabass Vision 110 +2, where you're getting into that 12 to 13 foot deep, depending on how long you give it a pause, how long, if you wait it or not. Most baits come suspending pretty well out of the package. I don't play around with color too much, and I don't play around with the sizes too much. I'm not going to have a bunch of everybody else's brands trying to throw one of this one and one of this one. And that leads me to my next point is get a brand and stick with it. Because what I like to do is I like to know everything that jerkbait does. I like to know how deep it dives, I like to know the action of it, and I like to know what it's going to do in different situations. That is absolutely critical when it comes to throwing a jerkbait. Because if I know what my bait does, that makes me way more comfortable to throw it around all kinds of different obstacles in the water. I like to throw jerkbaits around brush piles, I like to throw them around laydowns on the bank, I like to throw them through grass, because unlike a crankbait that you have to like rip it once you get it caught, a jerkbait you're naturally ripping it through already. So knowing what your bait does is critical, and knowing the depth that it dives is critical. Like this 6 Cents Provoke DD, I know I can get this bait to touch the bottom in 10 feet because I use my Garmin Panoptics unit and I watch that bait as it comes through the water. I can see how fast it takes me to get down to 6 to 10 feet, and then I can also see how long it holds there versus how much deeper it's going to go. And these baits actually suspend extremely well right out of the package. But you can change that with suspend dots or suspend strips. You can even weight them internally, or you can weight them by the hooks, which is typically what I do. That's generally what I'm going to go with. But knowing your bait is critical to knowing what depths you can fish that bait in. And that's one thing that I wish somebody would have told me, is just pick a brand and stick with it instead of buying all these different jerkbaits. And right off the bat, you can buy a few different companies and play around with it. But like I throw the 6 Cents and the Megabass Vision 110s, and that's going to be it. Because those are the ones that I know I'm going to get bit on, and I know what they do. I've taken them to swimming pools, I've tested them out, I've seen what they do, and I know it. And so I can throw them around laydowns, and I can actually deflect it off a laydown. Like I know what's going to happen when I get it to a point, using my Garmin Panoptics to pan over and see how deep everything is. Once I line it up, I know what I'm going to do, and I know I'm going to be able to catch those fish because of the action that those baits have. So I've talked a little bit about where I like to throw a jerkbait, but I really haven't covered it as much as why I throw it necessarily, and in some of the places that make me want to throw it. So one quote that's always stuck with me was by John Murray, who talked about when he can't get bit, he loves to throw a jerkbait. And that has stuck with me, and that has resonated throughout my fishing career, because when I'm struggling to get bit, I know those fish are in a pretty inactive mood, because anybody can really catch active feeding fish. If you're throwing a bait through there and those fish are feeding, they're going to eat it for the most part. But if they're relatively inactive fish or pressured fish, that jerkbait is a great way to get them, and it's hard to trigger those fish. You know, there's certain ways that you can do it, but a jerkbait is one of the best that I've found. And so I found that if I'm throwing that jerkbait constantly, then I can find both actively feeding fish and maybe switch up baits to give a better landing percentage. And I can also just cover water and trigger inactive feeding fish. And so some of the ways that I like to do that is I will fish pressured grass beds with it, for those of you guys down in like Florida or any surrounding areas, up north even. I will also fish it near laydowns to try to trigger those fish to come out of those laydowns like I talked about. And I will fish them pretty much anywhere that I can get them to go. It is one of those baits that I can throw in a lot of different situations to get fish to eat. And that's one thing that you can't really do with a lot of baits, is I can fish that. I have 3 different ones that I like to throw, and I can fish it from 2 to 5 feet, from 5 to 10 feet, and then from that 10 to 13 or 14 feet. And that's a really, really big thing, is just having a bait that I've talked about in multiple videos that you can do a lot with. Like a chatterbait, you can fish a chatterbait in a bunch of different depths. Crankbaits, you can fish crankbaits in a bunch of different depths, but you have to change baits. A spinnerbait, if I put a 1/2 ounce or a 3/4 ounce spinnerbait on, I can fish that all through the depths. If I put this 6 cents DD on here, I can fish that from like 5 feet down to like 11 or 12 feet, depending on the gear that I throw it on. And so with fishing these baits, I want to talk about rod angle, because you can change the way that bait dives with the rod angle that you use. So if I'm going straight down, that's going to be pulling that bait down, whereas if I'm pulling it sideways, that's going to kind of be trying to keep it at a parallel level. And you can also fish it up, which will bring your bait up, which is something that people really don't think about. They think about just, you know, out there working a jerkbait, you know, I might change my bait to go to a different depth, but I will run this 106 DD like 95% of the time, because I know that I can get it to fish in different depth ranges by changing my rod angle, or maybe having a rod with more heavier line on it, you know, changing that up a little bit. So one thing that nobody really talks about is the different species when it comes to a jerkbait. I've talked about the hooks that I like to use, but I haven't talked about why I'm so anal about hooks. The reason I'm so anal about hooks is because I live in a smallmouth dominated area where it's very 50-50, you know, even 60-30, 60-40, or 80-20 on some of the fisheries that I have. Sometimes some of the fisheries I live on 100% smallmouth. And so largemouth, you can get away with a lot of different hooks. Because of the name largemouth, you have a bigger area that they eat the bait with, they have softer tissue, and it really doesn't matter necessarily all the time, because when they get it, they pretty much got it, and they get more hooks in their face. Whereas with smallmouth, if you don't have the right hooks, you're going to get your heart broken all day. And I mean all day. Just for the simple fact they have a smaller mouth, they have a meaty mouth, but they have a lot of hard spots, because a lot of times smallmouth rely on blunt force to eat a bait, whether it's crayfish, gobies up here on Lake Erie, you know, anything on the bottom. And so their lips get very hard. And if you're not throwing the right hooks and you're keeping your hooks sharp, which is huge, you'll lose a lot of fish. And a lot of times you'll see them just having one hook like this, or they'll have, I've watched fish T-bone it, smallmouth, and not get the hooks. So keeping your hooks sharp and using the right hooks is why I'm so anal about this. Spotted bass I haven't had a ton of experience with, but I imagine they're kind of an in-between where you'd really want to start to be thinking about your hooks, because they have that little bit smaller mouth, they're more aggressive, they hit baits harder. And so keeping those hooks sharp and keeping the right ones on there and making sure you're throwing the right type of hooks can be really, really critical to whether you're having a really good day on the water, or whether you start to have a really bad day where you're losing fish and you start to pull your hair out. So what time of year does a jerkbait shine? A jerkbait shines in cooler water conditions for the most part, because those fish are harder to trigger. But another thing that I like to use them for is the fall months, where people don't think about it necessarily, because those fish are also hard to trigger because they get grouped up around bait fish. Springtime, those fish are kind of spread out a little bit. They're getting back into those areas where they're getting ready to spawn, they're moving up shallow, and that's why a jerkbait is so effective, because you still have those cold trends, but you have the same thing in the fall. So those are the periods when you have the most inactive fish. People get away from the jerkbait once those waters warm up, because you can get those fish to eat a lot more baits because they're more active as their metabolism rises. People never think about that. People are just like, oh, a jerkbait does good in the springtime because it's cold out. What does that do? That makes fish inactive. Same thing with the fall. So those are the reasons why I like to throw it. Well, obviously in the wintertime too, because those fish are inactive. But you have to go to slower moving baits, but that's a whole other world, or we'll dive down later. But thinking about those times when those fish are inactive, that's when I like to throw a jerkbait. That could be something as simple as during the middle of the day when things are getting tough, picking up a jerkbait because it might get you a few extra bites. Or, you have a cold front coming in, I'm going to throw a jerkbait because I know, even though those fish are mad at the world right now because you have a cold front, that's what I'm going to get them trigger on. That's why I like throwing them in Florida so much when I get cold fronts, because those fish hate life and it triggers them in grass beds. So keep that in mind when you're looking at all the conditions that you're dealing with on a daily basis. If you get a cold front, I don't care if it's in the middle of the summertime, a jerkbait can still be in a really, really effective way. You just have to figure out where you can throw it to get to those active, or those fish, to make the inactive fish active, whether that's on bluff walls in the summertime, which is a really, really popular thing, or whether that's on 45s going back into pockets in the springtime, around docks in the springtime when those fish are starting to stage up, or on those shallow grass beds throwing a shallower version in the fall as those fish are getting back into these pockets and chasing bait. So if you guys like today's video, be sure to check out this video I have talking about mag drafts and why they're such a popular bait and why not to be scared of them. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button to follow along with the channel. But thank you guys so much for watching. God bless every single one of you guys. And, I hope to see you guys out there on the water.